In the year 836 AD, a fleet of Viking longships rounded the headland and beached on the east coast of Ireland. The raiders drew their swords and ran inland toward a farming settlement they had spotted from the water. By the time they reached the cluster of round houses, the village was empty. The cattle were still in the field. The fire pits were still warm. There was bread on a table, but there were no people. The Vikings searched the houses, kicked over the floor mats, looked behind every wall. Nothing. They burned what they could carry and rode away. The villagers had not run. They were still there. About 15 feet underground, packed into a stone passage built specifically for that moment, listening to the boots above their heads. The Irish built more than 3,500 of these tunnels. We call them souterrains. Almost nobody talks about them anymore. This is the story of who built them, how they worked, and why an entire population learned to vanish into the ground beneath their feet. To understand why an entire population learned to disappear into the earth, you have to understand what Ireland looked like in the year 800. The island had no cities, no castles, and no central government. It was divided into roughly 150 small kingdoms called tuatha, each ruled by a local king who answered to a regional overking, who in turn paid tribute to one of the provincial kings of Connaught, Ulster, Leinster, or Munster. Most people lived in extended family groups on small farms scattered across the countryside. The standard home was a ring fort called a rath or leos in Old Irish. Archaeologists have catalogued more than 45,000 of them across Ireland, making the ring fort the most common ancient monument in the country. A ring fort was a circular enclosure roughly 30 to 50 metres across, about 100 to 160 feet, surrounded by an earthen bank and a ditch. Inside lived a single family or two. They kept cattle, grew oats and barley, and stored their dairy in wooden vats sunk into the ground. These people were not poor. The early medieval Irish economy ran on cattle. A wealthy farmer might own 40 or 50 head, kept communally with neighbours for grazing. Their churches were stone. Their craftsmen worked gold. The monasteries at Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, and Iona produced manuscripts that scholars across Europe travelled to study. But the Irish had one major weakness. They had no army. There was no professional military. Each tuath fielded its own warriors, usually a few dozen men, when called by their king. There were no watchtowers along the coast. There was no navy. The country had been at peace internally for centuries, give or take a few cattle raids between neighbours. In 795 AD, a fleet of ships appeared off the north coast of Ireland, and the entire system that had kept the country safe for 400 years was about to collapse in a single afternoon. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland landed at a small island called Rechru, which historians now identify as either Rathlin Island off the Antrim coast or Lambay Island near Dublin. The Annals of Ulster, written by Irish monks who survived these years, recorded what happened with brutal economy. The burning of Rechru by the heathens, and Skye was overwhelmed and laid waste. Skye was the Hebrides. The Vikings had just sacked 2 coastal regions on a single campaign and left. They came back the next year, and the year after that. By 820 AD, the raids were no longer a coastal nuisance. The Vikings had figured out that Irish rivers were navigable for miles inland, and that monasteries deep in the country held more silver and gold than any coastal target. They sailed up the Shannon, the Liffey, the Boyne. They burned Armagh 3 times. They sacked Glendalough so often the monks stopped rebuilding the wooden structures. Then they did something the Irish had never seen before. They stayed. Around 841 AD, a Viking force established a fortified camp at the mouth of the Liffey River. They called it a long fort, a ship fort. It became the city of Dublin. Within 20 years, long forts had appeared at Cork, Waterford, Limerick and Wexford. The Vikings now had permanent bases inside Ireland from which they could raid year-round. For the rural farming population, this changed everything. Before the long forts, a Viking raid was a one-day event in summer. After the long forts, raids became a year-round threat that could happen any morning. A column of armed men could appear over the ridge at any time, and ordinary farming families had two options. They could run for the hills, leaving behind everything they owned, or they could fight a battle they would lose. Then somewhere in the 9th century, in scattered settlements across Ulster, Louth and the Central Plains, the Irish came up with a third option. They started digging. The earliest souterrains we can date with confidence sit between roughly 500 and 750 AD. These were probably storage chambers, simple stone-lined cellars under the floor of a house used to keep dairy and meat cool. But after 800 AD, the construction changed. The chambers got deeper. The entrances got smaller. The passages got narrower. Engineers added features that made no sense for storing cheese. What made perfect sense was hiding from people who were trying to find you. A souterrain was not a cave. It was a piece of engineering as deliberate as a Roman aqueduct, built without mortar, without iron, without a single tool the modern construction industry would recognize. The builder would dig a trench in the soil, usually starting from inside a ring fort or under a house floor. The trench was about 1.2 meters wide and 1.5 meters deep, roughly 4 feet by 5 feet. He would line both walls with dry stone construction, large flat stones stacked carefully so each stone above bridged the gap between two stones below. The stones held themselves in place by their own weight and friction. No mortar was used because mortar was unnecessary, and because mortar would have failed under the wet pressure of Irish soil within a generation. The roof was the masterpiece. The builder had two options. The first was the linteled roof, where flat slabs were laid across the top of the walls like railroad ties. This was simple, but limited the width of the chamber to about 1.5 meters. The second was the corbelled roof, where each course of stones jutted inward slightly farther than the one below it, until the two walls met at the top in a peaked or rounded ceiling. A corbelled chamber could be 3 meters wide, roughly 10 feet, and stable for 1,000 years. Some still are. Once the structure was built, the trench was backfilled with soil. The grass grew back over the top. Within a season, you could walk over a 30-meter souterrain, about 100 feet long, and have no idea it was there. The entrance was the key. A souterrain's entrance was usually a hole in the floor of a house or a hidden hatch in the wall of a ring fort. Once you dropped down, the passage was rarely more than 1 meter high, sometimes as low as 60 centimeters, about 2 feet. You crawled. Then the engineering got serious. About halfway down a typical passage, the builder installed a feature called a creep. The passage would suddenly narrow to a hole barely wider than a man's shoulders. To get through, you had to lie flat on your stomach and squirm forward, your arms extended in front of you. You could not carry a sword through a creep. You could not crawl through a creep wearing chainmail. And the moment your head and shoulders cleared the far side, the people on the other side could simply hit you with anything they liked while you lay pinned, half in and half out, unable to defend yourself. This was not the only trap. A well-built souterrain had 3 or 4 chambers connected by passages of varying difficulty. The first chamber was the closest to the entrance, often used for routine storage of dairy and grain. The constant temperature inside, between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius year-round, or about 46 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, kept butter solid in summer and milk from freezing in winter. But beyond the first chamber, the design changed. The next passage might dip suddenly into a sump, a section dropped below the main floor level that filled with groundwater after rain. Anyone trying to follow you in had to wade through cold water in the dark. Then came another creep. Then maybe a side passage that branched off and ended in a dead end, useful for confusing pursuers. Some souterrains had what archaeologists call a guard chamber, a small alcove built next to a creep where a defender could wait with a club or a knife and ambush anyone who came through. The deepest chambers were almost always at the far end, behind every obstacle. These were the refuge chambers, large enough to hold an extended family of 15 or 20 people for several days. They had air vents, narrow stone-lined shafts that ran up to the surface, often disguised among rocks in a field. Some had small slits in the walls that allowed the people inside to see and hear what was happening above. The strategic logic was straightforward. When raiders appeared, the entire population of a settlement could disappear underground in under 5 minutes. Once inside, they pulled a stone slab over the entrance and waited. The Vikings could burn the village. They could steal the cattle. They could spend hours searching for hidden cellars. But the entrance to a souterrain was nearly impossible to find without prior knowledge of where it was. If the raiders did find the entrance, they faced a choice. They could leave, or they could go in. Going in meant crawling, alone, through narrow passages designed to trap and kill them. A single defender at a creep could hold off dozens of attackers indefinitely, because only one person could come through at a time, and that person was helpless during the few seconds of the squeeze. The math favoured the defenders absolutely. The Annals of Ulster contain dozens of entries about Viking raids, including specific accounts of monasteries being sacked and kings being killed. They contain almost no entries about underground refuges being breached. There is a reason for that. As far as we can tell from the archaeological record, they almost never were. The most striking evidence of how souterrains worked under siege does not come from any single dramatic find. It comes from the pattern that emerges across more than a century of excavations. In the inner chambers of souterrains across Ireland, archaeologists have repeatedly recovered the same suite of artefacts: butchered animal bones, fragments of cooking and storage vessels, charred remains of small fires, personal items like bone needles and spindle whorls, the kind of things you do not lose, you abandon when you have to leave in a hurry. These chambers were not occupied for a few minutes. They were occupied for days, sometimes longer. The people inside had brought supplies, butchered animals to eat, lit small fires for warmth, and lived underground in sealed stone chambers while something terrible was happening on the surface above them. We rarely know what the something was. We do not know whether the families inside came out to find their houses burned, or whether they came out to find that the raiders had given up and moved on. But we know they survived, because someone resealed the entrance behind them, and many of those entrances stayed sealed for the next 1,000 years. The Donoughmore souterrain in County Louth gives the clearest picture. Its passage runs for nearly 30 metres underground, about 100 feet. 2 separate creeps, a guard chamber, a final refuge room large enough to hold a family of 20. The entrance was hidden inside the inner building of a ring fort, accessible only to people who already knew it was there. When archaeologists studied the site in the 20th century, the conclusion was unambiguous. This was not storage. This was a fortress, built specifically to outlast a raid. The Vikings raided Ireland for roughly 250 years before the final Norse defeat at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. During that quarter of a millennium, they killed Irish kings, looted dozens of monasteries, and built 5 major coastal cities. They never broke the rural population. The farming families of Ulster, Louth, Meath, and Munster kept growing oats, breeding cattle, and raising children, because every time the longships appeared on the horizon, they had somewhere to go. Souterrains stopped being built around 1200 AD. The reason was not that the threat ended, the reason was that the threat changed. The Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland began in 1169 when an army led by Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, landed in Wexford. The Normans brought something the Vikings never had. They brought stone castles. A motte and bailey, and later a stone keep, was a fortification that stayed in one place. It allowed a small number of armoured knights to control a large area of countryside permanently. Once the Normans built a castle, the local population could not just hide for a few hours and emerge to find the threat gone. The threat lived in the castle now. Hiding underground was useful against raiders who came and left. It was useless against an occupying force that intended to stay. The Souterrain became obsolete almost overnight. By 1250, no new ones were being built. By 1400, the existing ones were either forgotten, used as storage, or filled in. For the next 600 years, Souterrains slept under Irish fields. Farmers occasionally fell through the roofs of collapsed ones while ploughing. Cattle sometimes vanished into them and had to be hauled out. Local folklore turned them into fairy passages and puka dens, holes in the world where the old people had gone. The Irish word for an underground chamber, uam, became a word for any unexplained hole in the ground. The first systematic study of souterrains began in the 19th century, when antiquarians started recording sites they had stumbled into, often after a farmer's plough collapsed a roof slab. The pace picked up in the 20th century with the work of archaeologists like Etienne Rhin, who spent decades cataloguing souterrain sites across Connaught. The standard reference today is Mark Clinton's 2001 study, The Souterrains of Ireland, published by Wordwell. Clinton spent years in the field, walking ring forts, dropping down into chambers, measuring passages with a tape and a flashlight. His work confirmed what fragmented earlier surveys had hinted at. The Souterrain was not a curiosity. It was a continental-scale defensive system distributed across the entire farming landscape of medieval Ireland. The Discovery Programme and the National Monument Service of Ireland now maintain detailed records of more than 3,500 documented souterrains. Field surveys continue to find new ones every year, especially in counties Antrim, Down and Louth, where the highest densities are concentrated. A handful of souterrains are open to the public. Donamore in Louth has been preserved with electric lighting and a guide. Drumina Cashel in County Down has a souterrain you can crawl into yourself if you bring a flashlight and don't mind the cold. The chambers are exactly as the builders left them: the dry stone walls, the corbelled ceilings, the narrow creeps that no Viking ever made it through. For 700 years, the rural population of Ireland solved a problem most cultures could not solve. They were attacked by an enemy stronger than they were, and they had no army to fight back with. They could not build castles. They could not field a navy. They had no professional soldiers and no central state to coordinate defence. What they had was stone, soil, and the knowledge that the ground beneath their feet could be reshaped. So they reshaped it. They built more than 3,500 underground refugees across an island the size of Indiana. They carried their families, their food, and their futures into the dark. And when the longships were gone, they came back up and rebuilt the houses above. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We investigate forgotten knowledge that the modern world left behind, not because the old ways were always better, but because some of them solved problems we have completely forgotten how to solve. Drop a comment and tell us, what other forgotten defensive structures or buried building techniques should we investigate next? Subscribe and let's keep investigating.